Right. And hi, everyone. This is Tamara from Fashion Roundtable. I'm here today with Fiona from Tradecraft and Dominique from Labour Behind the Label. Lots of you will remember the big news story of the summer, which was the revelations about the situation in Leicester. And those were really thanks to the work of Labour Behind the Label. Both of these organisations have shone a light on the issues of modern slavery. And modern slavery, although it's one of the largely unseen issues of the fashion industry, it's one of the biggest issues across the whole global supply chain. So in today's conversations, we very much want to shine a light on this work and celebrate the organisations that have been working so hard on this. So Dominique, could you just go back to the work that you did in the summer? Were these revelations shocking to you? Obviously, you've been in the sector for a long time, or what do you think made it explode so much in the summer?
I mean, I think our report into Boohoo, it was mainly on Boohoo's supply chain and working conditions in Leicester. It was shocking even for someone like me who I would have thought I had lost the ability to be shocked. I think some of the conditions that we saw really were on par on some of the old sort of sweatshops that you find in Bangladesh or Pakistan, or that you used to. And obviously what makes it more shocking to us, but also to the consumers and the media, is that it's going on, right under our noses in the UK. And really what made it really bad was the lockdown. So that this was taking place during lockdown, that workers were facing crowded factories, very little protection, being asked to go back to work or risking losing their job. So, not only was it the sort of the normal issues that you find in Leicester, which is, underpayment of wages, lack of formal contracts. But during this pandemic, we saw a almost total disregard for the health and safety and welfare of these workers. And I think that is really why it caught the media's attention and it caught consumers' attention.
I mean, it's something that a lot of us read. There was the Dark Factories article that came out 2 years ago in the Financial Times. But are you saying this was even worse? And in what ways has it been worse? How can it get worse?
I think in a way it was worse because, obviously the global garment industry has really been impacted by the COVID pandemic, and workers have faced different waves of negative impact. And I think what we saw was a huge increase in orders in Leicester because many other producing countries were in lockdown themselves. It was hard to get the goods produced. And we see a lot of the online retailers especially really profiting out of this. So their orders were increasing. So what they did, they pushed all those new orders onto factories in Leicester, who then, because of the nature of these so-called dark factories were sort of subcontracted. Often you had essentially garages where people set up sewing machines to make these garments. And a lot of the factories were working, 120% capacity, when because of health and safety during COVID, they should actually have been operating at, 30, 40%. So it made it all the more shocking.
And weren't there instances of workers being forced to go in when they knew they had COVID, and actually there was this severe consequences to that? I think that was part of the work.
Yeah, I mean, we found some terrible cases of workers who had either been tested positive and were told they had to go back to work and they shouldn't worry about it because, it's just the flu. If they didn't go back to work, they would get the sack. We had workers who were positive or had found out that someone else was positive in the factory and were told not to say anything, so to actually keep it quiet. We had instances where some, migrant workers were placed in incredibly vulnerable positions because they were working and had no sort of recourse, no knowledge of the new health and safety guidance, and no support. Coupled with that, there was all the issues around furlough fraud, so companies applying for furlough but not actually giving furlough, so telling the workers, if you don't want to work because you're scared, then you just get sick pay. But actually they were claiming furlough pay.
So they were profiting out of a pandemic on every level.
Yeah.
Have you seen a culture change in the response from policy leaders or from businesses in response to your work?
I would love to say I had. I think it's interesting because often, brands sort of lag behind and they're dragged into change, kicking and screaming. But I think I've seen several key brands that are really keen to take action because, there's a lot of positives about sourcing in Leicester. There's a lot of skills there. Mm-hmm. It's very close by. They don't have to pay transport. So it's, in a way it's more sustainable, mm-hmm. but they don't want to source from Leicester because of these, potential risks to their reputation. So we have on the one hand a number of brands that really want to see change, that are committed to doing things like making their supply chain transparent, looking into better auditing, and even, entering binding agreements and getting unions on board and union access. On the other hand, we have brands like Boohoo who have, responded to the independent review with some, rather underwhelming responses. And, for example, they've set up a charity fund for garment workers in distress, which, is I'm going to use the word gobsmacking, because they are leaving a trail of workers underpaid and undervalued all around Leicester. And, yet one of their responses is to set up a fund for charity. And at the same time, I think what we've seen is the government...
Which is tax deductible.
Probably it is tax deductible, and it makes them look really good if they have a charity. And the government, as you probably, saw in the summer, they were, saying, oh my goodness, this is terrible. We've just found out about this. We must do something. And, they knew all along this was going on. These reports, as you know, have been going on for years and years, and the government again set up another task force, as they did a couple of years ago, where they had raids, enforcement raids with various, the HMRC, the health and safety, immigration, labour enforcement. They all descend, they do these raids, and so far we've seen very little criminal prosecutions coming out. But what we have seen is, because these issues around immigration and the hostile environment, is it makes the workers even more fearful, especially those, who are at risk of modern slavery. They don't want to come forward because they might be detained. Mm. And we know, of one case from the summer where no action was taken against the owner, but one person has been detained and is still in detention. So it's really using old tools to sort of which is not a sustainable answer. We really need a whole coalition of stakeholders working to address issues around the lack of enforcement, the lack of legislation, the lack of powers from enforcement agencies, but also brand practices, abusive brand practices which have to be addressed.
So I see a lot of awareness of what's going on behind the scenes, but the consumer is still buying into it. What do we do you think, before I move over to Fiona to just answer some questions? What do you think that we need to make the consumer aware of, or be asking questions of those brands that they're buying from and that have got their loyalty?
I mean, it's hard because a lot of the online brands cater for the younger audience. who it's their first sort of foray into fashion. It's exciting. They can get cheap clothes. They can get it delivered the next day. But I think, before COVID hit, there was progress around the increasing numbers of consumers who were aware of the unsustainability of this. I think the next thing we need to do is to really push that you can't have a sustainable fashion industry without looking at the worker rights. But I'm sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. It's not mine. But I think what we need now is for government to actually step up. NGOs, we're a small organisation. Tradecraft is, you guys, you work with lots of different organisations. We don't have the capacity to try and uncover all the abuses, and the government really has to stop this sort of hands-off approach. And one of those things really is tackling and really reforming the Modern Slavery Act and really giving it teeth, because at the moment it remains meaningless.
So the Modern Slavery Act at the moment requires, it's an option, isn't it, for a business over, 32 or 35 million turnover?
I think it's 36.
Okay, got that wrong.
I might be wrong on that.
Turnover to declare whether there is modern slavery in the supply chain, and the amendment to Section 54, which Baroness Lola Young and others have been working on, would ask that to be an enforceable rather than an opt-in. Because obviously, if you've got the option to opt in and you're a big business and you don't know who your supply chain people are, then you aren't going to want to be a part of that, are you? Thank you, Dominique, and I'm sure we'll come back to you in a minute. But Fiona, could you just explain what Tradecraft do, who you are, and where your work is focused at the moment on this issue?
Thank you very much for the chance to talk. So Tradecraft Exchange is the sister charity to Tradecraft, the social enterprise. And we focus entirely on how supply chains work and whether or not they are or are not benefiting workers in the supply chain who ultimately do all the really hard work that we benefit from when we wear clothes.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic, we, like Dominique, became highly aware that because of the trade disruptions caused by COVID, loads and loads of suppliers were having their orders being put on hold or cancelled. And this was going to have absolutely devastating impacts for workers. So the estimates are that £12 billion worth of clothes have not been bought internationally, and something like £2 to £4 billion worth in wages is owed at the moment. And the ILO says that
what is the ILO? Sorry, the
International Labour Organization, which is a very conservative organization. It's a UN body, very authoritative, said that we got 86 million workers in extreme hardship. Now, the reason why I say these very, very, very big numbers is because essentially this is all down to the actions of retailers. And individual retailers make decisions with enormous consequences. And unfortunately, for example, the UK is absolutely the worst. So we owe the largest amount of money to Bangladesh. And after the 80 retailers who owe Bangladesh money, it's American and German retailers who owe about half each. And after that, it's Netherlands, Spanish, French, and some others also owe money in large volumes.
So to put that into context, Zara, which is a Spanish company, owes less than a UK retailer.
It's not by individual retailer. So 80 UK retailers owed Bangladesh in the middle of the summer £750 million. Billion. £750 million by 8 British retailers. So the consequences are enormous for very poor countries. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, India, they all have factories where people are utterly dependent on the orders of British retailers so that they have work and jobs. So, for example, if we were to take Bangladesh, well, Next is sourcing from 150 factories, Primark from more than 100, Matalan, Asda and M&S from more than 80 factories. So you can see why the consequences of these individual British brands' decisions is so big.
Yeah.
So what we're now working on is a recognition that it is impossible for these brands to choose voluntarily to improve their purchasing practices. They have made so much money by dumping risk onto their suppliers that we need to abandon the voluntary approach. And these retailers need to be regulated. And because there has been a positive experience of regulating purchasing practices in this country, whilst keeping the consumer offer exciting, dynamic, and innovative, it is possible for us to do this now for the fashion sector. So that is what we are working on. Allow these companies to carry on, but not with the abusive purchasing practices. The way that they buy from suppliers needs to be stabilized.
No, I think that you've made that point very, very well. With the brands where they're in crisis, the Arcadia Group, the Debenhams, etc., I'm guessing there's a mirror in the non-payment. Is that correct?
That is correct. But I also think
that debt, if they are bankrupt, then what happens to the people who they owe money to? What happens to is that debt written off?
I think we need to take a long view on this. There are two factors at play here. One is the business model of the garment retailers. It is a very exceptional sector. There are more millionaires and billionaires in the garment sector than there are in the food sector. So I could go through, I think it's the Kamanis with Boohoo, it's the Western family with Primark. It's quite a long list of individual family wealth. So we got Philip Day, Edinburgh Woolen Mill, Mike Ashley, Sports Direct. Matalan is the Hargreaves family, Waltons is Asda George, Anders Poulsen is Bestseller and ASOS. It's a lot of individual wealth. They have had the opportunity to extract millions in the past. We need to remember that Philip Green took out of the Arcadia Group more than £1 billion in payout in 2005. It was the largest payout to an individual in UK corporate history. So this sector has the potential to take money out and then to dump and let down suppliers and their own workers when times are down. It's an exceptionally bad sector, and I don't quite understand why it happens and why it works like this. It's my observation. So essentially, that practice, we have to clock. How is it possible for this particular sector to enable winners to take huge gains, but to abandon everything when times are tough? I don't understand. So that is one comment. Then the other thing to say is when businesses go into administration, what happens is that they then have the opportunity to essentially call time on everything they owe their suppliers. The clock stops, and the suppliers can't launch a court case to say you owe me this amount of money, because later on down the line, once the administrators have looked at everything, what happens is they then come to the suppliers and they say, we'll offer you 20p on the pound of everything that we owe you. So that's 20%. It's quite well known that Philip Green has a habit of putting his businesses into administration, dumping thousands of suppliers who he owes money to, forcing them to accept huge elements of discounts, possibly then selling a few shops, and then buying it all back again. It's a disgusting, purposeful approach of dumping suppliers and not paying them. So Mr. Philip, sorry, I should have said that was Philip Day. That's what Philip Day is likely to do with Edinburgh Woolen Mill. Philip Green, with the wealth that he's got behind him, could choose for Arcadia not to be in this position, but he's chosen to put it in that position to absolve himself of all the debts that he's got.
Yeah, and also they have a massive pension pot, which is at risk as well. The same with when they got rid of BHS a few years ago. When I worked in Parliament, we were getting a lot of letters in from constituents about that issue, because he's got a peerage, and of course he was the business advisor to the Cameron government with a non-dom wife, and the retail market is very much at risk in the UK, which is something I care really passionately about. I love a vibrant high street and the great consumer experience of having great service, which is the core of what Britain does really well and is really at risk from this. I think there's been growing awareness, but to put it into context, we've got this as a global issue. What do we do, and what would you say to the people watching this that they should be doing to ask the right questions in order to be better informed about what they're buying? What would you suggest, Dominique?
I think, there's lots they can do. What we normally say is to think before you buy. First of all, do you need that sort of £3 t-shirt? Where are you buying it from?
Or what was it, 5p and 4p on Friday?
Yes, I was looking at, I saw it first, had a sale where it was 99% off.
Yeah, same with things, yeah.
Which is, when you think of the thousands of people, mainly women, mainly young women, who have made those clothes and, got paid that 6p to make them, to see those garments being sold at 6p, in one of the richest countries in the world, it's shocking. But I think, think before you shop. But do, sign up to groups like Tradecraft, Labour Behind the Label. We have petitions, we have campaigns. Write to the brands, ask the government, ask your local MP what they're doing. They can raise questions in Parliament. As Fiona said, the UK has got a huge number of really global brands, and some of them have acted utterly appallingly during this crisis, really just dumping stuff on their suppliers. It was a knee-jerk reaction that they thought, oh gosh, we're going to be in trouble. Let's put it on those workers. And now, we see, although you've talked about Debenhams and Arcadia, we see Boohoo, huge profits rising. ASOS, misguided. Next is back in profit. Primark is, unexpectedly back in profit. They're not going to be suffering or worrying about whether they can pay the rent. But I think what needs to happen is this shift. We need more accountability. It is legally possible for brands to really put one over the workers. We see this time and time again, but it's immoral. So we've really got to shift that sort of morality and ethics into legislation. Otherwise, we will never change. We will never change this industry. It will continue to be a handful of people extracting maximum profits from many thousands, millions of workers all over the globe.
Thank you. And Fiona, you at Tradecraft did this really cool quiz on billionaires, which I thought I was going to get a 10 out of 10 and I didn't, so I answer all the questions, but you did it. It's like, could you just explain it, and I'll get us to share the link if we can in SHOWstudio while we're partnering with them. But what is the quiz and what does it reveal?
So the reason why Tradecraft Exchange wanted to highlight the quiz was because, as I explained, it's very surprising how many millionaires and billionaires own garment chains. It's really quite remarkably surprising. When Tradecraft started our fast fashion campaign, we did an analysis of all of the companies and worked out they could afford to pay. They or their owners can afford to pay. And so we decided that
the issue is that this non-payment is a will. It's will rather than financial. They're choosing not to pay rather than they can't afford not to pay. Yeah,
that is entirely correct. The owners and the businesses themselves have enough assets to be able to pay. They choose not to. Not only is it a choice, it's also unlawful. It is a breach of contract law. But because the suppliers are so afraid, it's completely unenforceable. So the British government has to recognise that the law is not enforceable. If they want a fair operation of the market, they're going to have to think about a different way of doing it. And because it is so profitable, our suggestion is that a regulator is put in place that enables anonymous complaints from suppliers, but that the regulator can also fine retailers enough to mean that it the retailer will lose so much in fines, they might choose not to do the abusive purchasing practices. That essentially is the formula that is working for our food retailers at the moment, who have also traditionally had an abysmally bad purchasing practices track record. And finally, and very slowly, that is improving thanks to the work of this regulator. So I would say, just like Dominique, join organisations like us, campaign with us. I don't feel that it is fair on the consumer to put the blame on them. Essentially, fashion retailers, have a specialised way of communicating to customers and evade the truth. So, I mean, I would recommend, if I'm allowed to share my screen, that campaigners look at our website, which has got a fashion tracker. And if they see a line of red boxes where essentially the retailer has failed to improve, then they should write to the retailer and say, we notice on the Tradecraft Exchange website tracker, you have failed to answer any of these questions. What are you doing? It's going to guide my Christmas shopping. I think that is fair. But I do feel that it would really help all of us if people joined us and campaigned for fair treatment in the sector. And that means that we need a regulator or a watchdog over these retailers with their terrible, 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 many, many, many years bad track record of bad purchasing practices.
I think what we'll do is we'll share your Instagrams and we'll share your websites. And I definitely want that quiz and any assets that you've got, Dominique, from Labour Behind the Label, so that people can have a look at these, because this is such a prevalent conversation. And I think it really goes hand in hand. For me, the conversation around modern slavery goes hand in hand with the climate change conversation. They are not one or the other. They are not binary. It's completely embedded. You don't see one without the other. And to know that these retailers could afford to pay and are choosing not to, when the stories that I'm hearing are really quite graphically horrendous about what these exploitations are leading to, and that we will cover during this, and also our work with the Ethics and Sustainability All Party Parliamentary Group. I hope that we can, in our way, shine a light on something and shift this to a culture change. And I want to applaud you both for the work that you do. And thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you very much.